Hey team, we're going to automate sending daily email reports using Gmail, GitHub Actions, and Cron. We'll also add the weather forecast with the Accuweather API, and we'll add a random GIF using the Tenor API. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and that little bell notification icon for future updates. Daily report emails are something that can be super important that might contain maybe some business information for the day, or it can be just something like a daily report for maybe you want to get some weather and a fun gift for the day, which is what we're going to build. Now, the first thing we're going to use in order to do this is Gmail, and while there's a lot of other providers available that can send mail for us, such as SendGrid, which you can check out my other video, we can use Gmail as an easy way to have an SMTP server. Now, to actually automate sending the emails, we're going to use a node script, and we're going to do that using GitHub Actions, where we can use the cron syntax. If you're not familiar with cron, it's a way that we can schedule when our scripts are actually running, and we can do that using this syntax here, where we have basically 5 columns which each represent a different frequency, where we're able to say exactly when we want to do it, whether it's here where we have at 4:05, or some of these other examples that they provide where maybe we want to do it every 5 minutes or 15 minutes. There's a lot of options for how we can schedule things using cron. Now, once we have our email ready to go, we're going to be adding some weather to it, and we'll do that using the Accuweather API. And then to make sure we're adding a little bit of fun to our daily report, we're going to add a trending GIF for our GIF of the day using the Tenor API. Now, to get started, we're going to create this all from scratch, and to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a directory, and let's call that my daily report. I'm going to navigate into that daily report directory, and I'm going to run npm init, which this is going to initialize my project as an npm project, which will give me the ability to install packages later, which we're going to do. But for now, for this purpose, I'm going to just simply hit enter through all of those different options, as they don't really matter too much for this particular walkthrough. And if you ever want to update it again after this walkthrough, you can just go over to your package.json file where you can update it completely yourself manually. And then I'm going to open it up in my code editor, where we can now see we have that package.json file. Now, the main goal of this project is going to be able to run a node script. So the first thing I'm going to do, and the way that I like to organize my projects, is I'm going to create a new folder under the root of my project called source. And inside of that, I'm going to call it main.js, where inside we're going to create what's called an immediately invoked function, where we're going to first define our function. It's going to be an async function, and let's call that run. But then we're going to first wrap it in parentheses, and then finally invoke that, so that what happens is immediately when this script runs, it's going to invoke this function. And the reason we're doing that is we want to use async await. And the only way we can actually do that is if we wrap it with the async, as this particular version of Node that we're working with at this time doesn't actually support top level async await. But we can make sure that this works by adding a console log. And I'm going to say running my daily report. But now when I open back up my terminal, I'm going to run node source main.js. And once I do, we can see that I get my console log. So ultimately what we want to do with this script is actually email with it. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up that email. Now, in order to actually send our email, we're going to use a package called NodeMailer, which is going to allow us to easily configure our application with this node package in order to actually send mail out using our SMTP server, which in our case is going to be Gmail. So in my terminal, the first thing I'm going to do is install this package, and you can use either npm or yarn. Just make sure you stick with whatever you choose from the beginning on throughout this tutorial, but I'm going to run yarn add NodeMailer, and it's going to go ahead and add it as a package. Now, if we scroll down all the way down to the bottom of this first page of NodeMailer, we can actually see an example, which for our case, we're just going to copy and paste this as it's a little easier than trying to write out this entire thing by hand. So to start, I'm going to grab this import so that we can import our NodeMailer package, and over inside of my editor, I'm going to add that to the top of my file. And then as we can see, this is currently using a test account, which we don't need to use, but we're still going to go ahead and copy this transporter section, which this is going to be able to allow us to set up and configure our mail system. So back inside of our project, I'm going to first paste that in at the top of my run. I'm going to first also change this to constant since we don't need this to be a let. But what we're seeing here is how we're going to actually configure our Gmail SMTP server to work for us. Now, Google actually makes this information readily available for us, and if we head over to their help section, which I just found by searching Gmail SMTP, we can see that we have our outgoing mail server, which we have all of our information right here. So to start, we can see that our host is going to be smtp.gmail.com, which I can go ahead and paste in right into that area. We also want to make sure that it requires SSL, so it's going to be secure, and that our port is going to be 465. So first I'm going to update that port. I'm going to make sure that it's set as true for secure. And then next we're going to need to add our authorization username and password. Now, the username is going to be your Gmail email address, and in my case, I'm using cosmo_jelly@gmail.com, but the password is a little bit more tricky. Now, once we're inside of Gmail, the way that we want to actually grab our password is we want to head up to our account settings. We want to click Manage Your Google Account, where it's going to take you to this page where we have a lot of options, but particularly, we want to head over to the security section. Now, I currently have two-factor authentication set up on my account, and I highly recommend that all of you do the same, as it's really important to make sure that you have your mail systems actually secure. So in this instance, what I'm going to do is create an app password, which I'm going to use specifically for this purpose. Now, just as a side note, if you do not want to add two-factor authentication, the only issue you're going to run into is if you use your actual password, you're going to have to turn on this option for less secure apps. But again, I don't recommend you doing this because, as you can see, it says that it's going to make your Gmail account less secure, which is a big deal. So I would recommend adding two-factor authentication and then using the app password like I'm about to show you. So to start, we're going to head over to this app password section, and we can see that we're going to need to re-authenticate with our password. But once we do, we land on the screen where we have two options, and the first one, we want to select an app. Now in our particular instance, we want to use Mail, and then we want to select a device where we don't really have a device. So we're going to select Other, and we're going to be able to put in a custom name. And I'm just going to put in My Daily Report Email. And that can be whatever you want as long as you recognize what that name means for that password for yourself. But once I hit generate, it's going to actually generate a new password for us where I'm going to be able to copy this value into my email system, into my configuration in the app, where this is going to allow us to actually authenticate to send emails. Now, just as a reminder, before you close this out, you're only going to be able to see this password once. So if you click done without actually copying it over or saving it somewhere, you're going to have to delete that password and regenerate it because you won't be able to see it. But I'm going to hit done and I'm going to head back over to my security, and we're actually done here, so I'm going to close it out. Now back over to NodeMailer, we have a second part that we want to add, and that's actually sending the mail. So I'm going to copy this other snippet where we have our let info equals await transporter.sendMail. And if we head over to the code, I'm going to paste it in right after. We actually don't need to set that to a variable in our instance. We just need it to send, but then we can update all this information to what we want it to be. In particular, I'm going to still have it come from my actual Cosmo_Jelly email address. And let's say that that's going to come from Cosmo. But where we want to send it to, that's really wherever we want it to be sent to. In Gmail's case, you can send them to yourself in the way that we're working through this, but some providers won't let you actually email to yourself. But I'm going to have that sent to hello@colbyfayok.com, which is my other email address, where it's going to send it to me for my personal email address. But then for my subject, let's call this Daily Report. And then we see that we have two other options where we have a plain text version and an HTML version. Now we want to make sure we have both of them enabled, as it's going to help make our emails more accessible, so that if somebody doesn't have HTML emails enabled or available, they'll still be able to get the information using this text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this using template tags, because then I'm going to put Daily Report at the top here, and it's going to just make it a little bit easier for us to compose these emails. But then at the top of the HTML, I'm going to add an H1 and still again put Daily Report. Now, believe it or not, this is all we need to send our first email. So I'm going to head over to my terminal and I'm going to run that same node script again. And we can see it's running the report. It finished. And we can see that we actually get our daily report right into our email inbox, where we can see that it sent it right to hello@colbyfayok.com, where I was able to receive my new daily report email. Now, before we actually move any further, as we talked about earlier, we're going to use GitHub Actions to actually send this automated. And we don't want to actually commit our information, particularly our email and our passwords, into our Git repository. So we want to store those as environment variables so that we can still access that data, but we're going to configure it from the outside of the application. Otherwise, we might compromise that information when actually putting it up on Git. Now, to do this, we're going to actually create a .env file. And this is going to be where we put in all of our environment variables. Now, in order to use that .env file, we're going to use a package called dotenv, which is going to basically allow us to require that package, and it's going to automatically load that env file when we're actually running this locally. Otherwise, it's going to load those environment variables from the process, which we'll see later how we do that on GitHub Actions. So in my terminal, I'm going to run yarn add.env, and while that's installing, I'm going to grab this require statement because this is going to be how we actually configure it. And if we head over to our project, right at the top of the page, before anything else, I'm going to require .env, and now we can get started actually adding our variables. So let's say, for instance, for our node mailer create transport, when we're configuring it, I'm going to say that I want this to be process.env, and let's call this mail user email. And I'm going to take that value, post it over into my .env file, and then I'm going to also take that variable name and I'm going to paste it in there as well, so that now we have that environment variable. Then I'm going to do the exact same thing with my password, except instead of email, I'm going to say a password, and I'm going to add that variable first, where we can then grab that password value and set it right inside of our .env. Now, optionally, we can use the same environment variable for our from property. Otherwise, we can set this manually however we want. So how about we make this different? That way, if we ever want to configure it to be a different from address, we can do that. So I'm going to add process.env mail from, and I'm going to go ahead and set that equal to just the email address for now, because we don't want to worry about the rest of that configuration for how this works. But again, inside of .env, I'm going to make that mail from and set that equal to my variable. And then finally, we have our process.env mail to, and just like before, we're going to grab that hello@colbyfayok.com, and I'm going to move it to the mail to and set that equal to the value. But now, just to prove that this works and we're actually loading our environment variables, I'm going to go ahead and run our script again, where we can see that it's running the daily report, and we can see just like before, we received our daily report again. So now that we actually have this going and successfully running as a node script, let's automate this using our GitHub Actions workflow. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my GitHub repository where I'm going to host this. I'm going to call it daily report, and I'm going to hit create repository. But before we actually put this up onto GitHub, we want to do one thing, and that's add a git ignore file so we can ignore both that .env file as well as our node modules, so that we're not actually committing it up onto GitHub. So inside of my project, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call that .gitignore, where I'm going to add my .env and node modules. And again, this is important that we add our .env to this .gitignore file so that we don't commit these values into our repository. But now we can go ahead and go through all these steps, where the first thing we want to do is run git init. So it's actually going to initialize this project as a Git repository. I'm going to then add all my files. I'm going to go ahead and commit those files, and let's just say init for now. And I'm going to be able to take that, I'm going to add my origin using this statement inside of this Git repository, and I'm going to go ahead and push it up to the main branch, which then once we reload the page, we can see that we have all of our files up on GitHub. Now, in order to create our action, we have two options, and one of them is just creating it manually as a file inside of our project. But instead, for this walkthrough, I'm going to show you how to do it through the UI. So we're going to head over to this Actions tab, where we can see that we already have some workflows available for us. And it doesn't really matter what you choose, because we're going to ultimately change this. But I'm going to click Set up this workflow under node.js. And I'm going to first get rid of all of the comments in here, because we don't really need it. But what we see here is we have, first of all, our name. I'm going to change that to daily report. Then we have our on, which is going to specify when this is going to actually occur. Now, we're not going to have this run on push and pull requests. We want to have this happen on a cron. So we're going to first delete that. And then as we continue on, let's rename this build to report. We still want to have it run on Ubuntu. We probably don't need all these node versions. Let's maybe just leave this at node 14 for now. But then we can see that it's going to first check out that code, which we want. It's going to then use node.js, which we want. And then it's going to run npm CI, which is going to install all the packages. Now, because I'm using yarn, I'm going to update that to yarn install. And then we finally have where it's going to run the build and test, but we don't need that either. What we're going to do is run our script. So we're going to replace that, and we're going to say node source main.js. Now, going back up to the top of this file, we have two things we need to do. One, we need to set our on mechanism, and we also need to set up our environment variables like we talked about before. So first of all, under the on property, we want to set this to schedule, as we're going to use the cron syntax. So we're going to then specify our cron, where we're going to set that equal to, we're going to use our parentheses, and I'm going to specify 0, 14, star, 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 which what this particular cron is saying is that this is going to run every day at 1400 hours UTC. And the nice thing is that I just learned today is that when you hover over it, it actually tells you when it's going to run. So that's a nice way to verify it's going to run exactly when you want. Now on top of that, I don't want to wait to test this, so I'm going to actually add a second on property, and I'm going to say workflow dispatch, and what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to actually manually run this workflow from inside of our repository. Now, as I mentioned before, the other thing we want to do is we want to specify our environment variables. So I'm going to add an env property, where here is where we're going to actually define all those. Now, the way that we want to define these, I'm going to do this a little bit quicker, and I'm going to replace all of these values using my multi-select, where we're going to ultimately use these to set our properties for these environment variables, and we're going to use GitHub secrets. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify those secrets, where we can grab the secrets object and reference that variable right from the secrets object. I'm going to copy all this in, head back over to my browser, where I'm going to paste that in as our environment variables, where we're going to be able to now add them as environment variables into GitHub secrets. But now that we're done, I'm going to go ahead and commit this directly to my main branch. That way it's going to be available to use when we're ready to go. So now I'm going to head over to the settings tab, where if we go down, we can see that we have this secrets section, which this is basically what the environment variables are going to be. And I'm going to want to add a new secret for every single one of those variables. So I'm going to hit new repository secret, and I'm going to head over to my environment variable file. I'm going to first grab mail user email and paste that in. Then I'm going to grab the value and paste that in and click add secret. And I'm going to do the same thing for all my other environment variables to make sure they're all there. But now once they're all added, we can actually get started and test this thing out. So I'm going to scroll back up and I'm going to head over to the Actions tab, where we can now see that we have this daily report workflow. And better yet, we can see that we have this workflow dispatch bar where I have this drop down where I can actually run this workflow. And I'm going to go ahead and click run workflow, where after a few seconds, or if I refresh the page, we can now see that we have this new job actually queued inside of our project. Now, once that refreshes, we can see that I actually got an error, and this is a little bit of a gotcha that I forgot to remove from the workflow file, but we can see inside of the logs that it's because we have a cache folder specified in there for npm. So what we can do is inside of the code of this, if we look in the actual workflows file, we can see where when I specified the node, we actually specify that cache. And I'm just going to remove that as it's going to cause my workflow to fail, but we can actually see in a second here that the email was still successfully sent even though we saw that error. Once that script was still able to run and pull in all those environment variables, we can see that I still got that daily report email. It's just that it failed afterwards. But we'll be able to see again in a second when we're actually testing it again that it's still going to work every single time because we now have that automated inside of our repository. And better yet, because we automated it with Cron, it's going to run at that 1400 hours every single day, which is about 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But now that we have our basic email script, let's actually add something useful such as the weather. Now, if you head over to the Accuweather site at developer.accuweather.com, you're able to create a free account, where once we create our account, what we need to do is create an application for the Accuweather API. We can do that by either going to this My Apps here or scrolling over your email address here and selecting My Apps, where then once we hit the page, we want to create a new app, where we're going to go through and we're going to fill out some details, where I'm just going to call this daily report. And we can see that we have a limited trial. We don't really need anything specific for this because we're only really going to be pulling once a day for the actual forecast. So we don't really need to fill out a ton of this. We can even change this to desktop website or if we want, or other, since really it's going to be an email. what we'll be creating this API for. We're just going to say in a weather app or a productivity app, because really it's going to be for us to be productive, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to use JavaScript. It's going to be business to consumer, even though nobody else is really going to use this. And we're going to say that we want it worldwide. And then finally, once we have all that filled out to however we want to fill it out, we're going to click create app, where it's going to go through and it's going to actually create that on the Accuweather system, where then it's going to also automatically approve it for us, unless of course something happens where it detects some kind of issue. But now we can see that we have an API key, which is going to be how we're going to interface with the Accuweather API. Now in this script, we're ultimately going to be making requests to the Accuweather API. So to do that, I'm going to install node fetch to make it easier for us to make those requests. Now node fetch is a way that we're going to be able to use the browser fetch API inside of Node. Now one thing that's a little bit of a gotcha, since version 3 of node fetch, they're using ESM, which is going to prevent us from being able to use the syntax that we're currently using, where we're going to use constant fetch equals required node fetch. And as we can see here, version 3 requires us to use import. So instead, we're going to install version 2 just for now to get around that, because we want to make sure that it's working for our use case. But if we're using a project that we can use the import statement, that's going to be your better bet to use version 3. So now to do that, inside of my terminal, I'm going to run yarn add node fetch, and I'm going to specify at, and I'm going to add the caret sign so it installs the package version that's going to be upgraded. And I'm going to specify 2. So it's going to actually install version 2.6.5 for us in this instance. But now inside of my project, I'm going to specify constant fetch equals require node fetch, if I spell that right, where we can now have access to the fetch API. Now, in order to use this, we have 2 specific things that we want to do. The first one is actually grab the location of where we want the weather. And then once we have that location, we want to grab the forecast of that location. So the first thing we want to use is the locations API. Now, once you hit the locations API page, we have a bunch of options that we can use. But what we want to do is we want to search for the city name, and we're going to search for that narrowed by the country code to make sure that we're specifying the actual city that we want to grab. So I'm going to click city search with the results narrowed by country code. Now, once we hit this page, we can see that we have our resource URL, as well as a bunch of fields that we can actually add in to test this thing right inside of the website. But we have this endpoint that we're going to want to use, and we can see we have this dynamic value here, which is going to be our location ID. Now, because I'm in the United States, I have this set to US, but this can be whatever it is for your country code to make sure that it's narrowed down to your country. But then we can also add the API key and the query, which is how we're going to get our location results. Now I'm going to go ahead and start writing this out, and before my actual mail system, I'm going to specify a new constant. Let's call this location request. I'm going to set that equal to await fetch, and we want to grab that endpoint that we're going to use. So I'm going to first copy the beginning of this, because it won't let me actually copy the US here, where I'm going to first paste that in. I'm going to then specify the US. We can see after we narrow it to the US, we also have that search. So I'm going to add search right after it. Now on top of this, we need to add 2 query parameters. The one is the API key and the other is the Q, which is going to be our search query. So let's start off with the search query, where I'm going to specify the question mark Q, and we're going to set that equal to, I'm going to use the template literal tags, and I'm going to have the interpolation in here where I'm going to say encode URI component, where then I can write as text Philadelphia, PA. And then after that, we want to actually also add the API key. So I'm going to add the and symbol, and we're going to say API key, and we're going to create another environment variable for our API key. So I'm going to add the interpolation again, and I'm going to say process.env.Accuweather API key. And now, of course, we need to actually set that key. So in .env, I'm going to add that key variable. I'm going to copy the key from my app, and I'm going to paste that right in as the value. So now this request should go off without a hitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to also say constant location data equals await location request to JSON. And then I'm going to console log out that location data so we can actually see what that looks like. I'm going to then put a return statement. That way we're not sending mail every time we test this. But now if I run node source main.js, we can see it's going to run the report, but now we have all of this location information, particularly one location since we have it so narrowed down for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania inside of the United States. So now what we actually want out of this payload is the key, which is what we're going to use to request the forecast. So I'm going to keep this console log and the return statement since we're going to use it again when we check out the forecast response, but I'm going to also set up a new constant for the actual key. So I'm going to say constant location key is equal to my location data, and I'm going to grab the first result since we only have one result and that's what we want, and then we're going to specify that we want the key property with a capital K there. Again, we can test this out by changing our console log and actually running the script, and we can see that it's going to log out that key for us. So now that we have our location key, we want to use that to request the forecast. So I'm going to head over to the forecast API, and we can see how we have a lot of options available to us, but I'm going to select the 1 day, as really this is going to give us the forecast of today. Now, since I was playing around with this before, we can already see that that ID is inside here, but this is going to be that dynamic value where we actually request a forecast by that key. So this can be whatever you want, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which might not actually be a valid key. But again, this is going to be where we actually specify our dynamic value. So just like we did with the other endpoint, I'm going to copy this resource URL that we're going to use for the endpoint. I'm going to actually duplicate all these 3 lines except the key, as we don't need that one. But for our location request, the first thing I'm going to do is replace the beginning of this query, as we don't need that. And instead of encoding the actual search here, we're going to replace that with the key. So I'm going to grab my location key and I'm going to put it at the end of this URL, just like it's specified inside of the documentation. But then we still want to include this API key, so we want to change this to a question mark so that it comes through as a query parameter. But then finally, of course, we don't want to have 2 location requests in data. So I'm going to change this from location, where instead of location request, it'll be forecast request, and then it's going to be forecast data. But now we can actually log out that forecast data. Now, just like before, I'm going to run my script. It's going to go through, and we can see that we now get the forecast for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it looks like, unfortunately, tonight it's going to be a little bit rainy. But now we effectively have that forecast that we can add directly into our email. And it looks like what I want to add is, let's see here. I want to add the headline text, which is going to be a human readable form of what the expected forecast to be. But then I want to also add the temperature and the min and max, and that's going to come inside of this array called daily forecasts, where because we're only getting the 1 day forecast, it's only going to be this one option, which is what we're going to use to grab the temperature. So to start, I'm going to now get rid of that return statement because we want to actually start setting up our email, but we want to add the weather here. So I'm going to start with the HTML one, where I'm going to add an H2, and let's call this weather, where the first thing for the weather is I want to add the actual forecast. So I'm going to add forecast as my label, close that paragraph tag, but inside here, this is where I'm going to add that text. If I scroll up, I'm going to grab that forecast data, and if we actually look inside the payload, or rather the response, we can see we're going to grab that from the headline and the headline text. So I'm going to specify forecast data, .headline, .text, and remember to use those capital letters as the first character of those actual words. But now I want to also add the temperature, and we can't actually see that. So while we know that this forecast is going to work, we want to log out to see what that's going to be. So we want to log out the daily forecasts, and then we want to actually grab the first value, the 0 index of that, and then we're going to log out the temperature of that. And again, let's put a return statement back in just for a second so we can see what that looks like. So now if I actually run my script, it's going to get everything, and we can see that inside of that temperature property, what we're actually getting is a minimum and a maximum where we have our value and our unit. Now, the only thing that's going to be tricky with this is it's going to be a very long variable name for us to actually save this data. So maybe we can make it. Now, usually for the sake of simplicity, I like to just add the variables with the properties just as they are, but because this is going to be very long inside of our actual template for the HTML, I'm going to add those to variables ahead of time just to make it easier for us to actually comprehend. So to start, I'm going to create a new constant called temperature, and I'm going to set that equal to this temperature value, where now I'm going to just use it as is, so we both want to use the minimum and the maximum where we have the value and the unit. So I'm going to grab this temperature constant, and again, get rid of this console or the return statement. And inside, I'm going to first duplicate that paragraph tag, and I'm going to make this the min, where I'm going to say inside that, I'm going to want the temperature, the minimum, and I'm going to want the minimum value. And then of course, I want to make sure that I add what unit it is so that the person reading this knows what unit it is. So I'm going to add the degree character, which I have here, which you can type out if you're on a Mac, where I pressed Control Command Spacebar to grab that. And then we can add the unit with the temperature dot minimum dot, what was that? The minimum dot unit. But then of course I can duplicate that line and add the max, where we can say instead of the minimum, we want the maximum. But I think now we're at a good place to actually test this out. And before we actually add the text, let's just run the script and send the mail just to make sure that this is looking good. So again, without that return statement, and I'm going to get rid of the console log as well, we want to actually go to our terminal and run that node script, where when we open it up, we can now see that we're getting the weather, we're getting the forecast, which is rain tonight, and we're getting the minimum and the maximum. So just like we did when we actually wrote the mail and the GitHub action, I'm going to go ahead and add all of that to my project. And I'm going to say git commit -m, and we're going to say adding the weather to the daily report. And remember, if you actually added it via the Actions UI like I did, you got to pull down before you actually push, because you want to merge down the changes that we did inside of the UI before we try to push out our new commit over top of that. But now with our changes up on GitHub, we want to also make sure that we add the secret. So I'm going to head back over to settings, going down to the secrets, and I'm going to add a new repository secret, where I'm going to go ahead and grab the Accuweather API key, and I'm going to add that as the name, and then I'm going to add the value, or the key API key as the value, and I'm going to hit add secret. Now, one more thing that we have to do for this to actually work, if we head over to the code tab and we go to the workflows and actually look at our GitHub action, one thing that we're doing in here that we haven't done yet inside of this workflow is we didn't add this environment variable to attribute itself to the secrets for our Accuweather API key. So I'm going to edit this right inside of the UI, and I'm going to come here and I'm going to add not the actual value, but I'm going to add the Accuweather API key name, where I'm going to say I want to set that equal to my secrets value of the Accuweather API key. I'm going to commit that in. So now next time we run it, it's going to include that variable. And like we did the first time, we can head over to our daily report and we can kick off a new workflow. And once we get that green check mark, meaning that it's finished, we can see that once again, I got my daily report, but this time it came from my GitHub action. Now, this report works really great as is, but I want to add something a little bit fun to start my day with. So how about we add a GIF? So to do that, we're going to use the Tenor API, which you can find over at tenor.com/GIF-API, where the first thing we need to do is we need to actually get an API key. Now, after you log in or create your account and you click get a free API key, it's going to take you to actually register your new API. For here, let's call it my daily report yet again, just so that we know exactly what it's for. And we can add a description, sending a daily report, very creative. And how about we sell it on Google, which we probably sell it somewhere else. But once we actually create that app, we can see that we now have, in addition to my test, we have this my daily report API key, which I can now use. Now, going back over to the documentation, we can take a look at the endpoints actually available to us. And how about, since we want to actually use a GIF of the day, how about we use the trending GIFs endpoint? That way, it's going to be the most popular GIF on Tenor at that time. We're going to get the first result, and we can even make sure that it's going to be something different every day. That way, we actually can give ourselves a nice little GIF to start our day with. So looking at this base URL, we can see that we have g.tenor.com/v1/trending, and then we have our parameters. Now, if I scroll down past this information, which is still important to read, we have all of our parameters where we have our key, just like we had with our Accuweather, and we have a bunch of other ones. But all we're going to use here is our key, and we're going to actually also use the content filter, which that's going to allow us to keep this thing PG-13. But aside from that, maybe we'll also use the limit, where we only need one, so we'll keep it limited to just one GIF that gets returned to us. So to start, because we made that change over on the GitHub UI, I'm going to first run git pull just to pull down that workflow change. But inside of my project, I'm going to actually take this existing forecast information and I'm going to use it to create my new request, where instead of forecast request, we're going to make this GIF request and we're going to make this GIF data. Now for the URL, we want to grab this base URL for trending, where we're going to take that and we're going to replace that Accuweather API for the actual Tenor one in our GIF request. But we also want to make sure that we're specifying the API key, just like we're doing here. But this time for the Tenor API, it's actually called just key. And instead of the Accuweather API key, we're going to specify the Tenor API key, which we're going to define now. So let's copy that name and head over to our .env file. And at the end here, we can add that Tenor API key. And if we head back over to our app, we can grab that API key so we can set it as our value right inside of our environment. But like I mentioned, we want to actually add a few more parameters. So in particular, first, let's add our limit. So and limit equals 1. And we also want to add that content filter. So I'm going to say and content filter, and we'll just set it for low, which is going to give us that PG-13 rating. Now, just like our other requests, let's actually test this out before we try to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and run console log with my GIF data and add my handy return statement. And now if I actually run my node script, we can see again my daily report, but now we have this payload of our results, which this is going to be our GIF. And we can even see the URL at the top level of this, that if we click and open this, we get what our GIF of the day is, which I'm not sure what this is, but that URL is the URL that goes to the actual website. It's not what we want to actually use inside of our email. So we want to dig a little bit deeper and we want to grab the media inside of the result. So again, because this is going to dig a little deeper, let's actually start expanding this like we did with the temperature. And let's say our GIF is equal to GIF data, where let's see, we want to actually grab the results and we want to grab the first item of the results, where then we want to grab the media. And now let's log that out to see what we have inside. And when we run the script, we can see now that we see all of the actual media, including some GIFs. We even have WebM, we have MP4s, but we have a lot of options. But since we're sending this in an email, we ultimately want to send it as a GIF. And I'm going to use the tiny GIF because it's a small version of the GIF. That way we're not actually sending some huge file for the person to have to download inside of the report. And we can even see what this looks like by grabbing that URL, just like we did before, and opening it up in the URL, and we see we have our GIF. Now, one thing as we're actually grabbing this GIF to keep in mind is this is actually an array of the media that we're grabbing. So we want to specify inside of this GIF, we want to specify the first result, and we want to grab the tiny GIF and then the URL. So like before, I'm going to get rid of the console log and the return statement and head down to my HTML, where at the very end, I'm going to add a new paragraph tag, where inside of that paragraph tag, I'm going to add my image. And let's say that I want my source to be, I'm going to add the template or the template tag for the interpolation. And I'm going to say I want my GIF, the first result of that GIF. I'm going to say I want the tiny GIF URL. And now let's test this out to make sure that it's actually working. And we can see that once we get the email, our GIF looks perfect at the end of our daily report. Now, before we push this out to GitHub, we're missing one thing. And as I mentioned before, we want to add the text version of this. And this is going to be just in case somebody can't actually see the HTML version. So what we're going to do is pretty much add the same exact thing, but we're not going to include the HTML. So to start, I'm going to include some spaces where I'm going to add the weather. And then I'm going to add some dashes to make sure it's visually separated. I'm going to say I want the forecast to be added for that line. And I'm going to add another one where I want to grab the min for the text version. And then finally, I'm going to add the max version. And because we still want somebody to actually be able to view the GIF that we're actually sending, instead of trying to actually embed it, which we can't do because it is plain text, I'm going to say daily GIF. And I'm going to specify from my GIF data above, I'm going to say that I want to just specify the GIF data dot results, and I'm going to grab the URL of those results. Now, probably the easiest way to test this is I'm going to simply comment out the HTML version. That way, when I open up this email, by default, all I'll have available is the text version. So I'm going to go ahead and run my script, where we can see now in my email, it looks pretty much the same, but it doesn't have the dynamic sizing, where because we're not using HTML, we're just sending plain text. So we see all the same information, it's just a little bit less flashy. So we're good to go here. I'm going to first uncomment my HTML, and then let's actually get this up to GitHub. And we're going to say that we added a GIF. We're going to push that out. And if you remember from the Accuweather API, we have one more thing that we need to do in two locations, where the first thing is we want to go to the settings and we want to go to secrets, where we want to add our new secret, where we're going to want to add the Tenor API key as that secret name, and then the value as that key. Then we want to go to our actual code so we can find our workflow. And inside, we want to edit it so that inside of our environment variables, we want to add yet another environment variable where we're going to say Tenor API key. We want to make sure we specify that it's coming from the secret, where we can then commit, and we can now get ready to test. So now finally, as our one last run for our workflow, we can head over to our daily report and we can click run workflow. Where just like my other flows, once it's done and I get the green check mark, I can open up my email and I can see that my email was sent as a daily report straight from GitHub. Now the cool thing is, because we set this up as a cron, we're gonna get this every day at that time that we specified. So we don't need to go in there and manually add it. We're just gonna get this in our inbox every day so we have an idea about what the weather is, and we can hopefully brighten our mood a little bit with a fun GIF. While there are a lot of great use cases for adding these scheduled automated emails in a business sense, where maybe you want to see the performance of your business or how your stock is doing, it's also great that we have the ability to do this from a personal perspective, where maybe we just want the weather like we did here, or maybe you want to actually replace some of the assistant stuff you get from Google Assistant or Siri so that you can get it right in your inbox, or something that you created yourself and completely customized to what you want. How do you like to start your day with your email assistant, or what are you adding to your report? Let me know in the comments. If you want to take this a step further and instead of using Gmail, maybe use a service like SendGrid, you can check out my video for sending emails with SendGrid, where I show you how to do it inside of a serverless function, which is a similar environment to what we walked through today. Or if you're a fan of space and you want to see the upcoming launches for SpaceX, I'll show you how to use the GraphQL API for SpaceX to actually add it to a Next.js app, which again is similar to the kind of environment where we do it inside of Node in order to fetch those results and add them to our page. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that little notification bell for future updates. Thanks for watching.